Palestinians and Palestinian Americans on Tuesday filed a lawsuit accusing the U.S. State Department of creating a loophole, allowing Israel to skirt federal legislation barring American military aid to foreign militaries that violate human rights law. The lawsuit, which was filed by 5 individuals and supported by the group Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, accuses the State Department and Secretary of State Antony Blinken of violating the Leahy Law, legislation passed in 2 parts in the late 1990s that built on the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961's prescription of U.S. military aid to foreign security forces that commit gross human rights violations. According to DAWN, the suit documents how the State Department has created unique, insurmountable processes to evade the Leahy Law requirement to sanction abusive Israeli units, despite overwhelming evidence of their human rights violations, including torture, prolonged detention without charge, forced disappearance, and flagrant denials of the right to life, liberty, and security, such as genocide, indiscriminate and deliberate killings, and deprivation of items essential to survival, including food, water, fuel, and medicine. Case plaintiff Ahmed Moore, a Palestinian American from the southern Gazan city of Rafah who has lost numerous relatives in Israeli attacks, told Zateo's Prem Thacker, "I'm hoping, through this action, through this lawsuit, that we can just call out the federal government to begin to enforce American laws." The State Department has sparked international outrage by repeatedly finding that Israel is using U.S.-supplied arms in compliance with domestic human rights law, citing the key ally's right to defend itself and the October 7, 2023 Hamas-led attack. However, Israel's 438-day retaliation has left more than 162,000 Palestinians dead, wounded, or missing in Gaza, and millions more forcibly displaced, starved, or sickened. Thousands more have been killed or maimed in the West Bank. South Africa is leading a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Last month, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, his former defense minister, for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Both men have been warmly welcomed in Washington, D.C. Congress and the Biden administration have approved tens of billions of dollars in arms transfers to Israel. U.S.-supplied bombs have been used in some of Israel's most notorious airstrikes. The U.S. has also vetoed numerous United Nations Security Council resolutions demanding a Gaza ceasefire. This lawsuit demands one thing and one thing only: for the State Department to obey the law requiring a ban on assistance to abusive Israeli security forces, DAWN Executive Director Sarah Lee Whitson said in a statement on Tuesday. For too long, the State Department has acted as if there's an Israel exemption from the Leahy Law, despite the fact that Congress required it to apply the law to every country in the world. As a result, millions of Palestinians have suffered unimaginable, horrific abuses by Israeli forces using U.S. weapons. Stephen Rickard, a former U.S. official who helped pass the landmark legislation, said that long-standing concerns that the State Department was not cutting off aid to specific Israel units, as required by the Leahy Law, have been given dramatic urgency by the tragic ongoing crisis in Gaza. If the State Department will not comply with the law, then it is time for the courts to vindicate the rule of law and order it to do so, Rickard added. The new lawsuit came a day after relatives of Aynur Ezgi Agi, the Turkish-American woman who, according to witnesses, was deliberately shot in the head while peacefully protesting the expansion of Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, in September met with Blinken in search of justice and accountability for the activist's killing. Referring to another American activist killed by Israeli forces while defending Palestinian homes, Hamid Ali, Agi's widower, said that Blinken was attentive in listening to us, but unfortunately repeated a lot of the same things that we've been hearing for the past 20 years, particularly since Rachel Corrie's killing. Ali called Blinken very deferential to the Israelis, adding that it felt like he was saying his hands were tied and they weren't able to really do much. A journalist asked State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller during a Tuesday press conference why the U.S. has not suspended arms transfers to Israel by invoking the Leahy Law and citing the cases of victims like Agi or Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian-American Al Jazeera correspondent who, according to witnesses and several independent probes, was deliberately shot dead by an Israeli sniper in the West Bank in May 2022. "We have taken those cases extremely seriously," Miller claimed. Referring to Agi, he added that he made it clear to Israel that her death was unacceptable, that it should have been avoided, it should have never happened in the first place, that we want to see the results of their investigation, and we want to see them change their rules of engagement. 5 Palestinians in Gaza, the occupied West Bank and the United States are suing the U.S. government to try to cut off American assistance to the Israeli military over its involvement in serious human rights abuses. The lawsuit, announced on Tuesday, accuses the Department of State of failing to implement a federal law that prohibits the transfer of funds to foreign military units engaged in gross violations such as extrajudicial killings and torture. The State Department's calculated failure to apply the Leahy Law is particularly shocking in the face of the unprecedented escalation of Israeli gross violations of human rights since the Gaza war erupted on October 7, 2023, the lawsuit reads. Israel's bombardment and ground operations in Gaza have killed more than 45,000 Palestinians since early October 2023, and the United Nations and the world's leading rights groups have accused the Israeli military of carrying out war crimes, including genocide. The lead plaintiff in the case, a Gaza teacher referred to by the pseudonym Amal Gaza, has been forcibly displaced 7 times since the war began, and 20 of her family members have been killed in Israeli attacks. My suffering and the unimaginable loss my family has endured would be significantly lessened if the U.S. stopped providing military assistance to Israeli units committing gross violations of human rights, she said in a statement accompanying the lawsuit. The case centers around what's known as the Leahy Law, a federal regulation that bars the U.S. government from providing funds to foreign military units when there is credible information implicating them in gross violations of human rights. Those violations include torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances and rape, the U.S. State Department says in a fact sheet explaining the law. We're asking the government to obey the law, Rod Jarer, advocacy director at Dawn, a U.S. nonprofit that campaigns for democracy and human rights in the Arab world and is supporting the plaintiffs in the case, told Al Jazeera. For months, lawyers and human rights advocates have urged President Joe Biden's administration to restrict assistance to the Israeli military amid multiple reports of violations against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Rights groups have documented Israel's use of U.S.-made weapons in several deadly attacks in Gaza, including indiscriminate strikes that killed dozens of Palestinian civilians. Palestinians in the West Bank have also experienced a surge in deadly Israeli military and settler violence since the Gaza war began, with the UN's Humanitarian Office reporting that 770 Palestinians were killed there from October 7, 2023, to the end of November 2024. The U.S. provides Israel with at least $3.8 billion in military assistance annually, and researchers at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, recently estimated that the Biden administration provided an additional $17.9 billion since the start of the Gaza war. Observers said that if the U.S. were to cut off that assistance, Israel would not be able to continue with its war effort. The violations committed by Israel are so widespread, very severe, that most if not all Israel's army units will actually be deemed ineligible for U.S. military assistance if the Leahy Law were applied, Jarer said. If the U.S. were to stop sending weapons, there is no way for Israel to continue its military operations, he added. But efforts to pressure Washington to apply the Leahy Law to Israel have largely failed. This year, the Biden administration considered cutting off assistance to an Israeli army unit notorious for its use of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as its involvement in the death of an elderly Palestinian American. However, the State Department ultimately determined that the Netza Yehuda Battalion could continue to receive American military aid after it said allegations of abuse had been effectively remediated. The Leahy Law includes an exception that allows the U.S. to resume assistance if the Secretary of State determines and reports to Congress that the foreign government has taken effective steps to bring the responsible members of the Security Forces unit to justice. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said in August that Israel had provided new information in the Netza Yehuda case, but he did not provide details. The decision to continue funding the unit fueled widespread criticism. While the Leahy Law should be applied equally to countries around the world, experts say Washington has created a specific set of procedures via what's known as the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum, ILVF, that benefits the top U.S. ally. The U.S. applies a unique, complex, time-consuming, high-level Leahy process for Israel, Charles Blaha, a former State Department official who was responsible for implementing the Leahy Law, explained in a June column on the website Just Security. For example, while Leahy Law decisions are typically made by lower-level U.S. government experts, in the case of Israel, the vetting involves higher-level, in-person meetings, as well as formal requests for information to the Israeli government that slow down the process. Blaha also explained that information that for any other country would without question result in ineligibility is insufficient for Israeli security force units. As a result, in the 4 years since the ILVF held its first meeting, the process has failed to approve the identification of a single ineligible Israeli unit, Blaha said. Ahmed Moore, a Palestinian-American plaintiff in the case, said he got involved in the proceedings over fears for his loved ones in the Gaza Strip. "My surviving family members in Gaza have been forcibly displaced 4 times, living in constant fear of indiscriminate Israeli attacks carried out with American weapons," Moore said in a statement. Ultimately, the lawsuit is asking a U.S. federal court judge to declare the State Department's actions, as well as its ILVF procedures, arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, and not in accordance with the law. It is also asking the judge to order the U.S. government to send Israel a list of military units that are not eligible to receive American assistance and issue an injunction prohibiting Washington from providing aid to units that have committed rights violations. While other legal attempts to end U.S. support for Israel have been blocked by the courts on the grounds that the judicial branch has no say over foreign policy decisions, Jarer noted that the case is asking for an administrative law to be applied. Tuesday's lawsuit was filed under what's known as the Administrative Procedure Act. "This is not an issue of foreign policy. It's not an issue of politics," Jarer said. "We're just asking the judge to instruct the State Department to obey the law,"